Good afternoon, good morning, good night, depending on wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our panel on gender equality in decision-making positions. By every possible measure, it has been an awful year. It has been a year of so much loss, lives, of course, but also paychecks, professional advancement, education, just to name a few. As the professional sphere has become narrower for so many, the domestic sphere has become almost unbearably broad. A childcare crisis has erupted, leaving mostly mothers to pick up the pieces. Unpaid labor, already a burden for more women than men, has taken center stage, but without good solutions. Many women may have stunted careers that will never get back on track. But these issues were in place long before COVID hit. Workplaces had never been especially great for women. Policy planning with women at the center was always disappointingly rare. Political leadership globally was and still is mostly male, and female leadership in the Fortune 500, for example, had hovered around a pitiful 5 or 6% for women for years. So sure, we can say COVID made things worse, and it did, but worse than what exactly? I'm Francesca Donner. I am an editor at The Times, and I am here to discuss these issues with our fantastic panelists, who I will now introduce. First of all, I have Anne Boring. If you want to raise your hands, everyone knows who you are. She is the Woman in Business Chair at Sciences Po. Next, I have Paola Profeta, the director of the recently launched AXA Research Lab on gender equality at Bocconi University. We also have Georges Desvaux. He's Chief Strategy and Business Officer at the AXA Group. And last but not least, we have Monika Queisser, whose name I know I didn't pronounce right, but she said it can be said in many, many different dialects and languages, so I did my best. She is the head of Social Policy Division at OECD. I know the digital format can occasionally be awkward, but we're going to try and run this a little bit like a real conversation, so panelists, please hop in when you have something to add. And if it becomes digital chaos, we'll just blame it on the technology. Is everybody ready? Okay. So I'd actually like to begin with the jobs numbers. And Monika, you're probably prepared. This question is coming for you. Many have talked this year about the so-called she session, suggesting that women have been driven out of the labor market in far greater numbers than men. But new OECD data and US Census data suggest this may not be quite accurate. Monika, I'm wondering if you can talk us through this. And then as a part two for this, does this change how we should address the economic crisis for women?
Thank you for that question, Francesca. It's indeed something that has been talked about so much, and people have been calling it a she session, and how this crisis was so different from the last great financial crisis, where we knew it was mostly men who were initially losing jobs in manufacturing, and where women were then going out to help bolster the household incomes and find work to compensate for the male job losses. So indeed, this crisis is very different. And initially, intuitively, everybody was thinking, well, this is going to be mostly women's jobs. Why? Because we're looking at sectors like services, like retail, and other sectors which were closed down. And I think there's a few things that we have to keep in mind when we look at the impact on women. One is that the verdict is still out. Literally all countries have been launching big programs to support jobs, the so-called job retention schemes, where people were put on hold in a sense, but were not made unemployed until the crisis passes. So that's one thing that means that we don't really see the full impact yet. The other thing is that we looked at exactly the data, and we found that surprisingly in many of the sectors where we thought there would be so much more women, it wasn't actually the case. Take beverage and food, for example. Everybody thinks, well, you know, this is very female dominated, but it's only slightly more, 53% globally is female of that workforce. It's over 60% in retail, but still, if you compare that to very feminine sectors like long-term care, where it's 90% female, or the global health workforce, which is 70% female, the health people, in the health sector, obviously jobs were increased rather than lost. So we have to look at this in a very kind of balanced way and see what is happening to women's jobs. On average, and I'm saying on average in OECD countries, we haven't really been able to identify a massive impact on women that is so much worse than for men. But that doesn't mean that in individual countries, there's at least temporarily, there is a stronger impact on women. For example, there's new data out in Italy, which shows that many of the job losses were in fact female job losses. So more than in previous situations, perhaps, we really have to be very granular here. We have to look from country to country, sector to sector, and we have to also keep updating our knowledge because the situation is changing on a daily basis.
Paola, as our Italian representative, I wonder if you want to talk just for a few minutes about what you are seeing in Italy for those women losing jobs.
Yes, in Italy, actually, many of the jobs lost are women's jobs. And actually, only in December 2020, there was a massive reduction of female jobs. 99% of the job loss were of women. And the female employment rate in 2020 decreased until 48.6%, which is a very low number. In Italy, it has always been very, very low, but this is the lowest in the last decade. So it seems that women are particularly affected. And I would like to add also a second element, which probably is more important for Italy than for other countries, which is not only related to the sectors, but also to the fact that the pandemic increased the amount of work to be done at the family level in terms of housework, domestic work, and childcare, especially. In Italy, in particular, schools closed a lot for a long period, but this happened also in other countries. And the closure of schools at the end increases the work that families have to do with their children at home. And unfortunately, in many countries, this additional work has fallen on women more than on men because of the asymmetric division of labor within the family.
Right. I mean, that is a story that, certainly we've been writing about a lot in the US, but I'm seeing it everywhere. And it's not really a story that's particularly new. I mean, I think, again, as I said before, all of this is things that COVID has exposed, but I think, it was happening long before COVID kind of broke on the scene. So if you want to go to unpaid labor, we can go there right now. I think anyone who's even alive today probably realizes that women do more unpaid labor than men. And this is actually true for every country in the world. And in my mind, the worst thing about unpaid labor is not simply that it's tiresome and boring and deeply unfair, although it really is, but that if you're doing the dishes or changing the diaper, you're not advancing professionally and you're not being recognized economically. And even kind of taking COVID, we can put COVID in the picture or not in the picture, but I think looking at unpaid labor, I mean, the fact is, in my mind, it's really the backbone on which our economies are built, but it goes so unacknowledged. And I wonder if I might ask you what your thoughts are if governments should start paying for unpaid labor. Should we start factoring it into GDP? Who wants to take this? Monika, do you want to start and then we can go along the line?
Sure, absolutely, Francesca. It's a fantastic question, and it's one that is being discussed a lot in the international sphere. The UN, the Commission on the Status of Women has been discussing this for many years because, as you just said, globally, it's a huge issue. It's a huge issue in rich countries, but if you start thinking about developing countries, of course, we're looking at a completely different dimension where it's the women doing all the agricultural work, the cooking, the cleaning, fetching water in many countries. So there we are even in a much higher level. The OECD is actually engaged in valuing unpaid work. It's a very complicated thing to do because what type of values do you put on there? Are you taking in each country? Would you be taking the price that you would be paying if you were talking about childcare for a babysitter or for somebody who helps you with your cleaning at home? Is that the price you pay? Or do you take a different price? For example, do you take what we call as economists the opportunity cost? So if you're a high paid manager and instead you're sitting at home caring for your children, should we take your hourly rate in terms of valuing that work? So even conceptually, it's super fascinating because for each for each decision that you make in that sense, you're actually putting a value judgment also, what this work is worth for society, for your family, for you as an individual. So I think that's it's something we definitely have to discuss. Are we at the point where we're going to start paying, governments are going to start paying people for unpaid work? I think that's a far stretch still. But I think one thing we can all do, every single one of us and everybody listening to us, is using the concept of our unpaid work in our household negotiation. When we negotiate with our partners, with our children, with our families, to see, yes, I'm doing this, but I just want you to realize what this is worth. Because as you said before, it is very humiliating often for all the women doing all this unpaid work, and particularly now in the COVID crisis, that people don't recognize this enough.
Absolutely, and it's really been exposed. Anne, I want to go to you next, and then Georges, you're going to be up after Anne. So we're going to stick on unpaid labor because it's just it's the problem that doesn't go away. So Anne, I wonder if you can pick up the thread here and add your thoughts to that.
Yeah, so I think that also the issue of unpaid labor is very much related to the issue of low paid labor. And what seems to have been quite interesting, I think, during this crisis is that it has led to a large debate as to what is the appropriate wage for workers such as nurses, for instance, or people who provide this type of essential care, and who are being paid for it. But what we're seeing is that those jobs still seem to be extremely undervalued. What is a little bit disheartening maybe is to observe that despite the large discussions and despite all of us, applauding service workers, and especially in the healthcare industry, and all essential workers in the beginning of the crisis, in the end, not much has happened in terms of increasing the wages that these workers are paid. So we can indeed, I think it's extremely important to negotiate within families. How do you divide tasks? But here too, we saw that during the COVID crisis, what happened was that when couples were not able to outsource services like childcare, for instance, and they had to take back the time or to find the time somehow to provide care for their children, in the end, it's still women that take up most of that time. There has been an increase in the share of childcare that is taken up by men, but share is not the right term. The number of hours that they actually did provide in the household, but in terms of the share of work, it's still very much unbalanced. So yes, families, they definitely do need to negotiate, but I think there's also strong policy implications that still need to be taken up by governments. And unfortunately, despite a lot of talk, I don't see much action going on.
Right. So, I mean, we're hearing sort of that the most essential workers, whether it's unpaid labor, which is absolutely profoundly essential, or whether it's, healthcare workers at the front of the line, are either unpaid or undervalued. Georges, I'm going to pick this up with you, and then Paola, I'm not going to let unpaid labor go because it's really my thing. So, Georges, you're a senior leader in a giant company, and I think you and I have talked a little bit, and I think we often sort of resign unpaid labor to the domestic realm and say, oh, well, it's between in a traditional household, it's between the spouses, the husband, the wife, they must negotiate, they must have the conversation. But I wonder if there's any role that a company can play, whether it's being a role model or something else, in sort of encouraging some of that balance.
I think absolutely there is a role to play, because I think there is always a reflection at home about what is the context in which the company makes you work. And in particular, I think what COVID showed us at AXA is that given that all of our 160,000 colleagues are practically all of them have been working remote for now a year, you have to be able to help the individuals to manage their work-life balance, if you want, at home. Because traditionally, in a sense, it's been functioning through the fact that you go to the office, that's the office space, and then you go home, that's a personal space. But that boundary doesn't exist anymore. once you are in a remote work. And so what I think we've been trying to do is to help define what are the right boundaries. For example, what time in the day do you start a meeting? At what time does meetings have to stop? We've also been quite active in helping with resilience training to help individuals, whether they're men or women, because I think it's at the end, it all collides in the same sphere. This is what really COVID has happened. And so we have to help our families to have this conversation and to help them with boundaries that help them manage their own life. And I think that's an incredible learning experience, and it's been a stressful, as you mentioned, learning experience for everyone. But I think it's an immense learning experience for the future. And we at AXA have in a sense jumped on it because we are really moving to what we call smart working, which is this notion that we want to make this flexibility part of everybody's experience for the foreseeable future. But we have to take into account the learnings. What are the right etiquette? What is the right rules? How do you help people? How do you make it acceptable?
Absolutely, we're going to get to the flexibility point soon. I do want to just kind of follow up with a quick question on that, and I wonder, what is the role of leadership at companies? We've gotten to this point where this year where everything that was hidden is suddenly in the very forefront, and should leaders be quite active, showing the kids are running in the background, or being honest and open about, I'm sorry, I have a crying baby, I have to go unload the dishwasher now. Is that helpful? And what do you think leaders can play a big part in that conversation?
Totally. I think this is really important. Leadership is, a large part of leadership is role modeling. And it's to show to people that everyone has a life. So, for example, Thomas Buberl, our CEO, in the different town halls, would talk about what his own learning was about working from home, and what he's learned, what his children has taught him. Same thing for me, and I think that's it's part of life. It's showing that you have a life, and you cope with the same dimensions, and that it is therefore acceptable for everyone to have that conversation is absolutely essential. The second element of leadership, which I think is really important, is that as you are moving with a more distant relationship and on videos and others, this is much more leadership is much more about empathy, about the ability to connect, to create relationships beyond just the task at hand. And that also taxes, I think, leadership skills. It's a very different model, and I'm sure we'll come back to that. But
we're going to get back to that. I'm so glad you raised it. I want to stick on unpaid labor for another minute, just so we can get back to Paola. And one of the interesting things that we've already brought up today is this idea that men are doing more. Okay, great. But my hunch is that there's a lot going on with sort of perceptions of what people feel that they're doing versus what they're actually doing. And, in my brief study of unpaid labor, which is nothing compared to what you've done, but, I do know that, men tend to do the unpaid labor that is maybe more fun or kind of comes up once a week rather than the grueling 3 times a day unpaid labor of doing the dishes, or men are washing the car once a week, or men are doing the lawn, or whatever. So, Paola, I wonder if you might be interested in picking up on that particular thread of unpaid labor, of what's actually happening, even if we're saying, oh, it's starting to even out. But my guess is it's not really. So I prefer to defer to the expert on this one, and I'd love for you to run with that a little bit.
Yes, of course. There are a lot of differences. For example, we know from several studies that men prefer to take care of children than to do domestic work. So, if anything, they prefer to spend some time with their children rather than washing dishes or other things. But and this comes from several surveys. But it's also true that what really matters then for example, for maternal employment, for women's employment, but also for fertility rate, is the sharing of exactly this not very nice task. For example, washing dishes and cleaning the house, etc. We have done, for example, a recent study where we interview the same couples before in the first moment. That was not during the pandemic, that was in general. So in the first interview, we asked them, these couples have already one child, and we asked them how they share their domestic work and childcare, and then we interviewed them after 3 years. And actually, what is particularly interesting is that couples were sharing domestic work, so housework, more than childcare, was more balanced, so was more symmetric between the two partners, are the ones who have a higher probability to have a second child after 3 years, and also to have the mother working full time. And we can do this. I mean, we show this also for couples who all declared that they wanted to have another child within 3 years, and so they were, let's say, on the same page at the beginning in terms of intentions. But actually, this better sharing of responsibilities and work at home is really a driver for the woman to decide to go on with another child, with an additional child, and also to continue working. So what is particularly relevant here is that what happens within the family is reflected in the labor market. So the family is the first place where gender differences start, and then we see them also on the labor market. So as Monika was saying before, we can really, all of us, do something very important, which is to negotiate within our couples, within our families right now.
It's so hard to do.
Francesca,
and I'm exactly going to use. So I want to ask you a question which you might be getting to, but also if you want to say something else, go for it. But before you start, I do really want to ask you this question because I think it's the perfect lead on. When you and I had chatted, you mentioned, if I'm not incorrect, that you have some new research which suggests that beliefs about traditional gender norms, say women belong at home and men should make the money, has become these ideas have become more deeply entrenched post-COVID. If I didn't get that wrong, could you just talk me through those findings? And let's just explore for a minute why you think this is the case and whether you think it might go away the further we get from COVID.
Yes, so indeed, that's exactly what I was going to jump into. So we conducted a study for the chair, also with my colleague from Erasmus University, Gloria Moroni, where we looked at the way that couples and individuals allocated their time during the first lockdown in France. So you were talking about differences in perceptions. Here we found something quite interesting, is that when you asked women about how do they estimate the share of the work that they're doing on domestic tasks globally, they basically say that they do about 2/3 of the job. When you ask men, they say that they do not quite half, just a tiny bit less, but definitely not 1/3. So you do see this difference in perceptions. And it's not clear. I mean, I think a lot of these differences in perceptions are also honest in the sense of men perceiving that they might be doing more and women than what they might be doing, and women maybe also perceiving that they're doing even more. But another thing that we found in this study was we asked respondents their beliefs in gender equal norms using questions that are from the European Values Study. So you have questions indeed such as, when a woman works part-time, children suffer, or what women really, it's nice to have a job, but what women really want is to take care of the home and the family. Or men tend to be better business leaders than women, for instance. And in these questions, we found that during the first lockdown in France, respondents tended to agree more often with these types of statements than the last wave in which these questions were asked, which was 2018 for France. So we hypothesize that there could be two mechanisms going on. One of them is that potentially when couples do not have access to the ability to externalize services such as childcare, for instance, and when they have to do this type of task at home, then perhaps putting a constraint on time, the time use of couples, might lead them to go back to believing in maybe more unequal gender norms. And what's quite interesting is that we do see that women were more often, I mean, it's still, in France, people tend to be very gender equal in their beliefs, much more than in countries such as Italy, for instance. But nonetheless, there is a little bit of a reversal of the trend. And it came from both men and women, but on different aspects. So for women, what we found is that for, if anything, they tended to have a little bit more of a mother's guilt effect when they were extremely time constrained because they were still working from home and also had to take care of their kids at the same time who were also at home, and it became way too much. So there's this increase in the mental load, but that did lead to say, that maybe the children did suffer when women worked. I don't know if that's going to have a really long-term lasting effect once, after the first lockdown, when schools reopened, and I think it's absolutely fundamental that schools and early childcare for children remain open, because you see that that's really there that the mechanisms are going to be crucial for women, just to enable them to leave them the time to work. And on men, what we found is they tended to be more lower education or lower income men who tended to agree more often with statements that correspond to unequal gender norms. So kind of more associating men to be the actual, earners of the income for the family. And this is more consistent with a conservative shift hypothesis, which is that when individuals are in a situation of economic uncertainty, that can lead them to fall back on more traditional beliefs and more conservative beliefs. So here too, in terms of the longer impact of this crisis, it will be absolutely fundamental to look at economic growth and making sure that we, pay attention to issues like economic inequalities, because this too will have long-term impacts, I think, on the ability of men and women and the desire of men and women to share paid work.
Definitely. I would like to follow up with those people, and my secret hunch in part is also that maybe men think this very strongly because a lot of those jobs are not very fun to do. So I would like to ask this question, and I'm going to put it to Monika to start, but if anyone wants to jump in, please go for it. I feel like we can never have this conversation without raising the question of a proper paternity leave policy. Many have argued that a proper paternity leave policy that men actually would take and feel comfortable taking, or even be reprimanded if they didn't take, changes everything. Monika, can I kick this one to you, please?
Sure, absolutely. And it follows nicely from what Anne just said, because what we really do need is a change in gender norms. And if you look at public policy, for good reasons, for very good reasons, governments have very little influence on what people do in their homes. And, they should not be influencing this too much. But they do have one policy lever, and that is parental leave. Because parental leave can help influence people's decisions on how they share work and life and family responsibilities, in particularly childcare responsibilities after the birth of a child. And there has been a tendency, like often in these topics, coming from Nordic countries. Iceland was a pioneer, but also other Nordic countries have followed, and even a more conservative country like Germany has now followed, is reserving large parts of the parental leave for fathers. And so if you have a situation as an employer where it almost doesn't matter whether you hire a young man or a young woman, because when they have a child, either of them will be taking 6 months of parental leave, then we will have a very big change, not only in the household, the way that parents share the time, but also the way young women are regarded by employers, because that will be the same for young men and for young women. So it is a very, very powerful tool. However, just having parental leave is not enough. It needs to be long enough. It needs to be mandatorily shared between men and women, and it also needs to be paid. Because you have some countries where there is plenty of parental leave or father's leave available, except nobody can afford to take it, and then it defeats the purpose.
Who wants to hop in? Paola, go.
Yes. I think, according to what we already said, what is very important is also to have the paternity leave as a period only for the fathers right after the birth of the child, which is typically much shorter than the parental leave, and in some countries it's just a few days. But this is also particularly relevant because if the father has to stay at home and not work when the child is born, it means not only sharing responsibilities at home with the mother, but also for the firm, understanding that of course also the fathers can stay at home. So it helps changing the gender norms, not only with respect to the society and what individuals and family think, but also with respect to the firms, because we know that a lot of stereotypes and these types of bias are well established at the firm's level among the employers. And also that there is this stigma that when fathers stay at home taking care for their children, it's not. It's kind of. It's not really a good idea because they are considered not very committed to their job. So if we change, if everybody stays at home because this is the way we do it, then of course this is going to change. So the norms are going to change, and actually the stigma can be the other way around. Those who don't take the leave are somehow the stigmatized people. But in many countries, and I always think about my country, but not only. I mean, Italy is particularly conservative, but this paternity leave should be really substantial, like not a few days, because otherwise it's almost useless. But it also has to be not, excludable. So it means it's not possible to leave it to the mother if you don't take it. So it has to be exclusive for the father and fully paid. Because the other problem of parental leaves many times is that they are not fully paid. They are paid like 30% of your salary. And of course, if in the couple, the partner who is paid, who has a higher wage is the man, which is typically the case because there exists this pay gap between men and women. So if man earns more than women and if the leave is paid only 30%, of course, men are going to take it. So there is clearly not incentive for the family to have fathers taking the leave. So what I think we need is a period for the father, exclusive for the father. In Italy, even mandatory, because if it's not mandatory, it's very difficult that people accept to take it, but this may depend. In any case, that if you don't take it, it's lost. It's not that you can reconvert it in something different, that, for example, the mother takes it, and fully paid. Of course, this is going to be costly. But I think that this is the right moment because it really may help changing the gender norms, the culture, starting within the family, but also including the firms, so the employers.
Can I just hop in here?
Francesca, if I may, I totally agree with what you just said, Paola. And I think, for example, it's an issue that I've personally followed in my different roles, and become very convinced this is very important, the paternity leave. At AXA, we instituted in 2017 a global parental leave where you have 4 weeks to start. It's not it's 4 weeks paid leave for the co-parent. What I find very interesting is that I looked at it the last time, probably 2019, over 60% of people were taking it. So, and I think exactly to what you were saying, it becomes a norm, and it becomes socially acceptable. Therefore, it brings the family, which I think is, for somebody of, my generation, you were actually discouraged to bring the family in your workplace, in a sense. So it's just not acceptable for a man in particular. Now it's actually makes the family and what is part of you, which is your family, into the workplace. And I think it's very essential. And what I've also found is that it's true in pretty much every country. It's a universal need. I've had those requests, whether it's in Japan, whether it's in South Africa, whether it's in Europe. And what's interesting is, and this is where companies, in addition to governments, can play a role, is once you institute it as a norm, as something that's normal, then suddenly you see men just jump on it, because actually many would want to have it. They just wouldn't want to single themselves out by asking for it. And so therefore it has to become policies.
Right. And I think it's so interesting, especially if you think of it as an economic loss. If you don't take it, then it starts to look quite interesting. And I certainly, the sort of younger families we've interviewed and looked at, the men want to be part of the household just as much as the women do. So, and also, of course, the men can actually learn how to do the job, because I'm a bit tired of hearing, I don't know how to do it.
Very true.
It's not rocket science, guys. I'm going to move on to policy, and I just want to give you a chance if you had anything to add to the paternity leave debate, or we can move on. Oh, Monika, okay, you're up.
I just want to add a very small factoid which confirms what Georges was just saying. The two OECD countries which have the most and longest leave are Japan and Korea, yet fathers there are very reluctant to take it. So it shows you that even if you have the right policy in place from a government perspective, we really need companies to show and lead the way, that they almost expect the fathers to take this, and that it then is destigmatized, because in very conservative societies, you can see that it's not enough to just have the policy. We need a lot of action around the change of social norms around it. Just wanted to add that.
I'm so glad you did, because I think one of the real problems we've got actually is this sort of cultural entrenchment. People might say, we want change, but the norms and traditions always just slow things down, even when there's policy in place, just like you said. And Georges, we've talked a little bit about this, and you may have thoughts as well, but, what's the private sector's role in shaking things up? And do you want to take a crack at that?
Yeah, no. So I think at the end of the day, policies are policies, and the government need to be thoughtful of this. And it's terrific when you have the right policies. But as you were saying, Monika, if companies don't help the change process, it won't happen. And so I think you have to translate policies into your own company policies, and then make it actually acceptable and appealing. And that's including leadership, walking the talk, role modeling, making it applicable. And I'll give you an example, which it's in Japan. When I first ran a business in Japan, there was absolutely no part-time work. There was literally very limited part-time work. And in fact, people told me, and women told me, it's just not feasible in the Japanese system. And this was not a Japanese company, so it was even more surprising. So we did institute it as a policy, as a worldwide company policy that you could take. Would be normal. Within the next literally 2 months, more than half of the people who were taking the flexible opportunity were men, Japanese men. So it tells you that if you actually apply yourself to the situation, you can. And this is why in companies like ours at AXA, we are trying to really be at the forefront in policies. So we just came out with our smart working policy that says basically you can work from home 2 days a week for the foreseeable future, and we will add to it all the training and development and capacity to help. We've also launched significant global healthcare with mental health visibility for all our people. So companies have both that obligation and opportunity to accompany the change, to listen to what our people want, and sometimes don't really.
Companies are powerful, and they can make change. I hear you on that. And I want to just ask you quickly let's tie this up, and then we're going to move on to our next topics.
Yes, I think there are three ways that generate change for firms. They do need incentives in order to invest the time and the effort and the costs to actually generate change in the corporate culture in general, and how they treat men and women and how they foster gender equality. The first one are government policies, and what we've seen with laws, quota laws on boards, for instance, is that they tend to work only when they have an enforcement mechanism. So only if firms are really afraid of being sanctioned in case they do not implement them. If you have soft quotas, they tend not to work. So I think like having these types of strong incentive mechanisms, that's extremely important. The second dimension or type of actors that I see right now are really shaping how firms behave are investment firms that are asking companies to be a little bit more on board on gender diversity and diversity in general. So it's the same thing here. It is a strong incentive for firms. If they want to get financial support from the finance sector, then they also still need to act in order to promote more gender equality. And then the third incentive direction that I see is from young graduates and especially young male graduates who are also now caring about work-life balance. And I think this is a way for firms to try to attract the best new talents, new graduates, is also by offering better, a better balance between work and life. But if you don't have these types of mechanisms, I don't think firms move all that much. But I do see movement right now. So let's see if it lasts.
I'm glad you mentioned the word quota, because I feel like everyone sort of looks up and thinks, oh my goodness, but I'm going to go there with the quotas. I feel that women are sort of overlooked in policy in particular, in large part because there aren't many women at the table to begin with, but it's not just policy, it sort of stretches to every area of life. So, all right, team, let's explore how we're going to bring more women into the room, to leadership, to the boardroom. Does it need to be forced, mandated? Does it need to be penalized? Does it need to be quoted, to use that word? And you kind of already weighed in on that, but you can pick it right back up if you want. We can start with you and then go down the line. Or Paola, you can start. You look ready?
Yeah.
Okay.
As you prefer. I've been working on the quota subject for many years. So there are several arguments. So first of all, the gender balanced leadership, let's say in general, is certainly beneficial. It's beneficial for several reasons. First of all, because we know women are 50% of the population, so it's not a minority, and women are even more educated than men right now in many developed countries. So they have the right competence and talent and etc. So just leaving half of the population outside the decision-making positions, it's simply a waste of talent, of resources, and so it's not efficient. It's not equal, of course, it's not fair, but it's in particular, it's not efficient. So that's the first argument. A second argument is that a gender-balanced leadership, which of course does not mean that we replace men with women, but a gender-balanced leadership may be successful. It's a good strategy because men and women are have complementarities in their traits, in their ways of looking at several things, in their perspective. So diversity is always a value, and we know this now. There is really an extensive literature suggesting that diversity is a value, is richness. And the third argument is that having a gender-balanced leadership means also that some items in the agenda will finally be addressed. So it's very difficult. I'm not saying that it's impossible, because it's also very difficult to find a causal relationship, but it's very difficult to talk or to tackle deeply some arguments or some policies which are in favor of gender equality at the end with an exclusively male-dominated leadership. It's much more complicated. So female leadership, gender balanced leadership, is one of the drivers. Of course, it's not the only one, but it's one of the drivers towards having a more open discussion about policies and measures at the firm level or at the policy-making level that at the end are going to be beneficial for gender equality. And in terms of quotas, I have conducted a lot of studies on quotas, in particular on quotas on boards of directors that have been introduced in several countries in Europe now, starting from Norway, but also then we know Italy, France, Germany. I mean, now they are almost everywhere. And the general finding is that they have been beneficial for the composition of the board, at least the quality of the governance. So it's very difficult to find effects, causal effects on performance, so on returns, profits, etc. But it's common knowledge that they increase the quality and the competence of the boards, because basically the status quo of these places before the quotas was a male-dominated world, where the main criteria for selecting people was not only a meritocratic criteria. So opening also to women forced the boards to look more carefully about the composition of their members, and there is this type of substitution of new women entering and old men exiting, and the new women are somehow better qualified than the old men exiting, and at the end the overall quality increases, because this is a little bit the contradiction at the beginning, it seems, because many people say quotas are against meritocracy, because basically people are appointed only because they belong to a certain group and not because they are good enough. But this is not what happened at the end, because the average quality even increased because of the entry of women. And this is going to have positive results, which is something that we are observing already in the data. So, of course, the soft things that Anne was mentioning, I don't even call them quotas. I mean, I call them recommendations. So, for example, in Spain or other countries, so those are recommendations because they are not quotas. Quotas means that there is a strong enforcement. So at the end, there is a dissolution of the board. So you have to comply. But what we know from the experience of these countries is that all companies, all firms follow the rule, and they found the right women, they appointed the women, and things went very smoothly. The markets reacted very, very well. So we have also studies, say more financial studies that we have conducted, looking at the reaction of the stock market at elections with the quotas, and there was a positive reaction. And this, of course, may depend on the status quo, which was certainly not efficient, because it was kind of male-dominated world, masculine monopoly. I mean, it has been called in several ways. But the quotas are a kind of shocking policies to change this equilibrium, which was not efficient. Totally. I am personally in favor. Just one word, and then I finish. I am personally think that quotas, since in the ideal world, we don't need quotas, and we all agree with us, in the ideal world, we don't need them, they can also be considered like a temporary measure, which is what happens, for example, in Italy. So for a while, we need them, because otherwise it's difficult that naturally the process will evolve towards this equality situation. But luckily, we will not need them forever, because it's really to shock a little bit the initial equilibrium, and then we will not need them forever.
Yeah, that's
sorry if I was long.
No. I want to make sure to get to everyone, and frankly, one day maybe we won't even need to be having this conversation at all. But Monika, Anne, can I ask your view on quotas? Georges, anything to add to that? Yes, no, thumbs up, thumbs down.
If I may, it's a question that's, I am like Paola in the sense that in the ideal world you wouldn't need them, but I think pragmatic observation is that they do serve a purpose. I do think the fear of quota is fantastic. It always makes people to move. But sometimes you need to kickstart. But at the end of the day, you have to measure and you have to have targets. So you have to measure at every point in the life of the different leadership roles in a company, and you need to see whether that's progressing. You need to measure at every like we do, for example, at AXA. When we are appointing a new senior executive, do we make sure that we have a pipeline of women as well as men in to consider for the role? Do we hold ourselves accountable and publish it? To your point on investments, do we actually are willing to stand in the front of the mirror and stand in front of the world and say, where are we progressing? So at AXA, we have been progressing quite rapidly over the last 2 or 3 years, but it's way far from where we want to be and we have committed to be. But I think that's notion of you commit, you target, and in some cases you help the system with quota is something that is needed for a while.
Yeah.
Yeah, let me just add very briefly.
Please.
The one thing that we've seen is that there has been, for the time being at least, not as much trickle-down effect as we would have hoped for implementing gender quotas on boards. And now the question is, should gender quotas be implemented at other levels, and especially at the C-suite? And this is definitely a type of policy that will be quite interesting to see which countries actually end up really implementing them and what are the effects. And I think that is likely to have perhaps a stronger role model effect also on women who are lower down in the hierarchy, to know that, if they provide effort and if they actually develop a career strategy, they really have good chances of moving up the ranks. And that's super important.
Yep. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit about kind of work and returning to work and all of that. And I also want to just ask Monika one more policy question, if this is okay. Monika, and all of you, but in particular Monika, my policy expert here. I don't know if you read yesterday but President Biden signed an executive order establishing a gender policy council in the White House. It's going to report directly to him, and it's not the first of its kind, but it is the most powerful to date. I'd love to ask you what you make of something like this. Do you think it's a good model for other countries to follow? And sort of as a fun add-on, I'd love to hear, do you have any guidance for the 2 women who are running this policy council?
Okay, this is an interesting question because it's actually not such a new idea to locate the responsibility for gender equality in policy terms at the center of government. So be it the White House or be it the cabinet offices of different countries, like Japan has that and others. And the question is always, is this the most powerful way to influence policy, or is it to have a dedicated ministry with a full minister, with a budget? Because what often happens in many countries is that they get given this responsibility. What they're supposed to be doing at the center of government is gender mainstream all the policies, meaning that you take a gender perspective on whatever you're doing, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's labor market policy, health policy, environmental policy, across the whole range of policies to take this gender equality perspective. But oftentimes it turns out that if these gender councils or gender advisors or junior ministers in the presidency are not given a budget, that their capability to actually move the needle remains limited. For example, in France, you also have a certain situation where you have some issues which are funded, but for the rest of the issues, the gender minister has to convince her colleagues in different areas to actually do this policy. And so my advice would be, if you want this to work, give the people who are responsible for a budget both the people who are responsible for gender equality, both a real budget, but also some political power. And that could be in different ways. This could be with indices where you name and shame companies, for example. This is also for other areas where they really have a decision-making power. They can bring in their own laws and not rely on other sectoral ministries to do that.
No, I think it's really interesting. I'm kind of dying to see what happens. I think what's different this time is they do have actual full-time staff dedicated. It reports to the president. They will have people crafting policy. Before it was always kind of a sort of nice to have but a little bit sideline thing. And other agencies are going to be responsible for reporting on their gender progress as well. So we'll see how that goes. I think that's going to be interesting. I'd like to just we have a few questions, and I want to also just take a few minutes at the end just to talk a little bit about the return to work, the future of work, working from home. It's only a conversation that could take up several hours. I think one of the most interesting questions this past year has kind of been our move to the digital space. What many companies said was impossible actually became possible because they didn't have any choice. And I'm really curious, to hear from you. I think we've seen sort of the obvious problems of awkward digital meetings and children running around, but also some bright spots like flexibility. And I'd love this panel to weigh in on whether you think that this move to the digital space, of course, assuming you can take your job into a digital space, is in some ways sort of the great equalizer, or whether it's placed women at a deeper disadvantage. I'm also going to add to that a question that we have from our audience who's asking about kind of the multitasking of work, kids, home, and the sort of layers of stress, and how we can sort of acknowledge that as we're working in this digital space. And as George had said, we may never go back to that normal. We may always allow AXA employees to work 2 days a week from home if they wish. So I think I want to begin with all of you all at once, but let's start with Paola, and then we can go from there. Does that sound good? Okay, and we just have a very few minutes left, so.
Yes, very quick. So I think there are both risks and opportunities, as always, in this phase. So the risk is that women will, first of all, we know there is a digital gender divide, so they are less ready to enter this digital skills, digital world. But in particular, the risk is also the fact that if we go back to normal times, let's say after the pandemic, and women are the only ones who remain working remotely, let's say at home, then we have even worsened the situation, the gender gaps. The opportunity is that we will go back to the normal times, and we will use this flexibility in the right way, which is not what we have done so far, because so far we have worked remotely at home, but it's not the real smart working, which really means flexibility in terms of time and space. And in this case, if this is taken both by men and by women, not only by women, then we have the opportunity to improve gender equality, also because responsibilities within the household can be better shared. And we have proofs. For example, we have worked on this before the pandemic, on the use of flexible work arrangements, in a paper where we were able to show that flexible work arrangements increased the sharing of housework by men up to 50%, which is a lot. So in the long run, if both men and women are going to, let's say, enjoy this flexibility, this is going to be good. But there are a lot of risks, so we have to be careful.
Okay.
If I may,
okay, go.
one quick thing. So I'm a bit of an incorrigible optimist. So you'll allow me my pink, but I think it is an opportunity in the following sense. As we move back into this new normal, where I hope people will do like we will, and you said we may, no, we will allow people to go and work flexible at AXA. I think that will benefit both men and women. But it does have one element to that of change, which is that the managerial capabilities are going to be different. The leadership capabilities are different. They're much more about how you lead people through, not about what they do every day, what you watch them, but you trust them, you empower them to do things. It happens to be, I think, a quality that in general is something that is that women are more comfortable with. I think it's research has shown that. So I think there is a massive capacity for women as leaders and women as colleagues to actually flourish in that environment. And that's my belief, and I hope I'll be seeing it happening. But I think there is a real positive force going forward if we all work in the same direction.
That's a great point about the burden that falls on the leadership, because you've got to be able to manage that, and we've got to be able to manage in a new way. And Monika, thoughts?
Maybe just briefly to say that I think we really have to worry about a different divide, not only the gender divide here, because let's face it, people like us here all on the call, no problem. We can all work from home and we have all the possibilities. It's very likely we have relatively comfortable living arrangements where we have the space, maybe even a dedicated workspace, but this is not the case for everybody. And I think we really have to be careful and mindful that we introduce more equality along socioeconomic lines and along all the other lines where we know that the world of work is unequal and risks being more unequal in the future. And for companies, for example, I think it's great that also women and men who are not in kind of leadership positions or in the type of work we do have also been working from home now, because I have to say most companies thought that for assistants, for example, it wouldn't be such a good thing to work from home. And now we see that works very, very well and everybody's doing it. So I think that's the positive news. That is also good news for removing other inequalities from the world of work.
Yeah, I'll just add also one thing that's very important is the quality of the space that you have. So do you have a room of your own to be able to focus on your work? And what has a study by the French Demographic Institute shows that women, even high-end executive women, less often have a space where they can work quietly and in really good positions. And so this is also something that can have long-term consequences on career trajectories if you're slowed down also, in your ability to focus. So there are still quite a lot of challenges ahead. But I do think that a lot of people have experienced positively some aspects, at least, of remote work. And it's interesting to see how firms will have to adapt.
I'm so glad you mentioned the space issue, because it was totally overlooked and definitely a real one if you're sharing your house with various small, loud people. Okay, I've gone over by 3 minutes, but I want to end with a fun question. It's a fun question. There isn't really a right answer, I don't think. But I'm going to ask each of you to answer in a word or two max this question. When it comes to solving for gender equity, and equality, where should the primary burden fall? Should it be government leadership or corporate leadership? And I'm going to go along the line and you just have to pick one. All right, Paola, go.
Both. Government, corporate, and everybody, even individuals. Yes, I think it's responsibility to all of us.
Okay, Anne, go.
Just to differentiate myself, I'll say more governments, because government policies really drive change and create the incentives that make firms create change.
Okay, Georges, go.
Individual leaders, regardless of government or others, all of us, it's all of us.
Monika, you've got the closing word, go.
Government needs to lead by example.
All right. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you for this extraordinarily interesting conversation. I loved chatting with you. We tried to recreate a dinner party. I don't know how effective it was, but I certainly had fun, and I'm so grateful for your time. Thank you so much, and looking forward to hearing more about what you're doing, reading up on your research, hearing more about all of our great work, and going forth in this year ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.